In the last lesson, we discussed about the Azure overview. So we tried to understand what kind of services will be provided by Azure as part of infrastructure as a service and as part of platform as a services, and what are the benefits of using the Azure. So in this lesson, we'll understand Azure architecture components. This session is very important session for could be a developer or could be an administrator or a network administrator or could be anybody. They need to understand this architectural components of Azure and the terminologies what Azure is going to call. Okay, that makes it easy to use Azure and configure, install, deploy, or whatever we want to do it. So we'll understand Azure infrastructure. We'll understand Azure account, subscriptions, resource groups, what are those resources, and we'll try to understand what support are available from Microsoft. So we'll try to understand Azure infrastructure first. So how does this Azure infrastructure is being built? Now, we use the terminologies called as an Azure regions. Then we use called as an availability zones. Availability zones. There are two different terminologies which we use it in Azure when we are deploying any kind of resources or configuring any kind of resource in Azure. We use terminology called as an Azure regions, or we use called as an Azure region in a simple way. And one more terminology called as an availability zones, or in a simple terminology is also called as an edge zones. So let's understand what does this mean by Azure infrastructure and zones. So Azure region is basically a geographical location where Microsoft has built data centers. Like they call South India, Central India, West India. It's basically a geographical location where Microsoft has built data centers. So what Microsoft does is they have built data centers and they're calling that as there could be 2-3 data centers. For these data basically centers, they're calling it as a region. They're calling that as a region. So this is a data center 1 internally, and this is a data center 2. And in a region called as a region called as South India. So South India is the region name given by Microsoft for a couple of data centers which they built in that particular region. So in the specific region, we might have 2 data centers, 3 data centers, or a couple of data centers. So we call an Azure region is a set of data centers which are available in a specific geographical region. We call it as a region. And these data centers deployed, I would say, within the low latency, it means they are not very far away. Like these data centers, not like one is Chennai, one is Bangalore. Within the Chennai itself, where we call it as in South India, where Microsoft has data centers, maybe a certain distance to avoid the any kind of a natural disasters. Okay, so at a certain point of distance, they build these particular data centers, and these data centers are connected through a dedicated, I would say, called as a network, which is called as a high capacity network with high capacity network. So there appears like an high capacity, I would say, called as a network bandwidth. Okay. But really, Microsoft will not expose how many data centers are available in a specific geographical region. We know only as a region, but Microsoft has built a couple of data centers within that geographical region, which are highly connected, which are basically connected with a low latency and connected like a local area network with a high capacity network bandwidth. So like this, so Microsoft has built data centers in multiple regions. I'm taking it in India, they have called as an, let's take two, like this. So like this, the Microsoft has 60 plus geographical locations and more than 160 plus data centers, what they call it, across the globe, across the globe. Now customers can choose any region and deploy their resources. Nothing but customers can choose a South India and deploy their virtual machines. Customers can choose Central India and deploy their resources. Now, the cost of the resources may vary based on region to region, based on region to region. The cost of the virtual machine in South India and the cost of the virtual machine in Central India might be slightly, there could be some difference in terms of the cost based on the infrastructure which is being built and the backend, a lot of other factors which they consider in setting up the price for a specific resource. So if I create a virtual machine in US data center, and if I create a virtual machine in India, the cost of these two virtual machines are not the same. So we should be very clear that. Later we'll understand why we would need these regions now. Okay. Now, like this, which we call it as an Azure regions, Azure regions, or Azure region. Now we use something called as an Azure availability zones. There is a terminology called as an availability zones. But another terminal is called as in zones. Now, what Microsoft has did is in within the specific region called as in a central India as a region, they completely isolated certain data centers. Now, in central India, there are set of data centers which are completely physically isolated from one data center to another data centers. So this is a set of data centers physically separated from a perspective of a power failure, connectivity failure, or any kind of disturbances from the natural resources or basically any other external factors. If there is a power failure in this particular set of data centers, it doesn't impact another availability zone. So this is called as an availability zone. So availability zone is a zone 1. We call it as a zone 2. We call it as in zone 3. Zone 3. Like this, in many geographical regions, Microsoft has physically separated the data center to isolate the failure. For any reasons, there is a power failure in a zone 1. It doesn't impact the zone 2 and zone 3. Could be network connectivity failure, hardware failures, any kind of a failure which happens in a zone 1 will not impact zone 2 and zone 3. So within the specific geographical region, Microsoft has basically grouped the data centers and backend with the power connectivity, internet connectivity, and other things. And they called as a zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3. Now, what is the advantage of these zones? If I create a virtual machine in a zone 1, if I create a virtual machine in a zone 1, for some reasons, from a Microsoft side, there is a power issue in this particular zone 1. My VM will go down. It means my application is down. Now, if there is some issue at a zone 1 in central India, and as my resources are sitting in zone 1, if there is some issue with the zone 1, my applications and my customers are impacted. Now, what Microsoft says is, hey, you can have virtual machines running the same application and deployed across 3 regions, or what we call 3 zones or 2 zones, and have a load balancer. Distributing the traffic across these 3 virtual machines. Now we have a load balancer which distributes the traffic across the 3 virtual machines. So this will help us. The zones will help us to improve the availability of our application by distributing the virtual machines across the zones. So for some reasons, the physical servers in the zone 1 got failed. So this VM will go down, but the other 2 VMs running the same application are still up and running, and your load balancer is distributing the traffic to do these 2. So to improve the availability of your application, So we can use multiple zones to distribute our resources. The zones are not available in all the geographical regions. So Microsoft has built these availability zones in only specific geographical regions. They are coming up with another regions. So when you're deploying the resources, so when you choose the region, you need to verify whether the zones are available in the specific geographical region. And if there is a need for you to achieve a 99.999% of your application availability, then choosing a region having an availability zones is most important, because you need to distribute your virtual machines or the applications across the multiple zones. For any physical or any failure at Microsoft site in one data center should not impact your applications. So the zones are basically nothing but a zone is basically a set of data centers isolated for power failure, connectivity, then like in what we call it as an and cooling, what we call as an conditioners or anything. So if there is a cooling system failure, there will be a lot of heat generation. And because of that, there could be an impact on the infrastructure, and which can bring down, due to power failure, it could basically bring down these data centers. Due to basically connectivity failure, then if there is an internet connectivity failure at the zone 1, then our VMs will not be accessible. Okay. So that's the advantage of zones. So as I said, the zones are not available in all the regions. Okay. So on what basis? The question here is on what basis we need to choose the region to deploy resources, right? Resources. Now Microsoft has a data centers across 60 geographical locations. But do I need to choose a South India or a Central India or an UK East or a Singapore or whatever? Now, the first and foremost thing which we need to consider is any regulatories. What is this regulatories compliance requirements? Government compliance and regulatories, what we call as an now. Now you have some kind of a finance applications. So as per the government compliance and regulatories, you should not put your finance applications outside of India. Like many countries have their own regulatories and compliance requirements. Now, when I'm start deploying my resources, I need to choose whether I need to keep it in India or no. So if I keep my virtual machine, which is running a finance application in UK or some other geographical region, even though it's cheaper, but you're not complying to the local government regulatories. The second could be, where are your users? Where are your users? Now you have applications. Could be your ERP applications, HRMS application, manufacturing applications, data warehouse applications, okay, supply chain marketing applications, sales applications, marketing applications. Like there are so many applications where the organizations will use. Now I have a manufacturing unit in Hyderabad, and all my customers are based in South India, and majority of the partners are going to use it in South India. My application should be faster. So if majority of your users are nearer, now, if your users are nearer to South India, then basically the latency will be less. So you need to consider the latency. Now, where are your users? Okay, all your users are basically located near to and basically around in South India. Now, which region is the nearest one? Now, is it a South India region is the nearest one, or a Central India is the latest one, nearest one, or West India is the nearest one? Now, you need to consider that from a perspective of a latency. From a perspective of a latency. Now, if I put my virtual machines at Central India, all my users are sitting in South India, there is some latency. If a data center which is sitting in South India is nearer than a data center which is sitting in Central India. So look from that perspective, that is not only regulatory, but where are your users? And another consideration, latency from a perspective of, and the last one is in cost. Cost. Maybe your users are being spread across the India. Your basically users are being spread across the India. Now for you, if you host the application in West India or a Central India or a South India, it doesn't matter because the users are spread across the India. For me, it doesn't matter. But and which geographical regions, the cost of the resources is less. Cost of the resources is less. So we need to take that into consideration. And last is in basically services. Is service availability. Now you choose in a Central India, but you are looking for some data warehouse application. But Microsoft Azure is not providing the data warehouse application service in Central India because in all the regions, all the services are not available. So before we finalize the a region at the point of time, we need to consider that, okay, I'm going to use compute plus availability sets plus a multiple zones is required for me, okay, for high availability purpose, okay. Now, which basically region is providing me? Now, if I go to the West India, I don't have availability zones. If I go to Central India and South India, I have an availability zones. Like now I need to choose. My requirement is on service availability. Now Central, so West India is cheaper than Central India, but in West India, we don't have that service availability. Okay. So based on all these particular factors, we need to choose the region. It's not simply that we go and create resources on South India or Central India, but there are some factors what we look at from here, regulatory compliances or where are your users and which is the data center which is nearer to you from a perspective of a network latency, then which one is going to be cheaper for us and whether the services are availability. So before you make a decision, so think about all these questions and have an answers all these things and you can have this particular ones. So when we go to the look at the regions, we can see in this diagram. So Microsoft has data centers in all over the world. These are basically called as in regions. Called as in regions. So based on requirement to requirement, we need to choose it. So that's what we call it as in the Azure infrastructure, how it is basically built. Now let's go to the account. Now these are all regions. This is what we call as a physical infrastructure, which is being built by a region. Okay. So let me take another region, which is called as West India. So I'm taking the regions which are being available in India. So South India, Central India, and West India. So this is what we call it as a physical infrastructure. A physical infrastructure which is being built by a Microsoft across like an what called as. So now, how are the customers are going to use these data centers? There is basically a logical layer. So we use something called as an Azure account. Azure account. Anybody who would like to use the Azure services, he need to have an account in Azure. An account is just an identification of the organization or an individual in Azure. In Azure. So now Microsoft, before providing an access to you, he says that create an Azure account. And he says that, hey, who are you? From which geographical region you are from? Okay. So what is your email ID? What is your phone number? And basically, what is your company name? What is your basically taxation details? Like it basically takes the organization details or the individual, basically. It is basically legally bounded to use the Azure services or resources, I would say services. An account means I'm accepting the terms and conditions with Azure, saying that, okay, whatever the resources which I'm going to use, that I'm legally bound to pay for it. Legally, I pay for it. So anybody who would like to consume the services of Azure, they need to create an Azure account. And it will be verified using a credit card. So in order to validate that you are a human being and you are a valid user, not a robot or anything, and you're legally bound and you're consuming the services and you have to pay for them. So what Microsoft does is as part of the initial, when you set up an account, is going to verify your identity using the credit card so that whatever the resources which you create at the end of the month, it will be charged using your credit card. So during the setting up of an account, an Azure account, so it'll ask you all the personal details like first name, last name, email ID, geographical location, phone number, then organization details, then it asks you the payment method, then terms and conditions, and what support type you want it, and does that. So it basically, before it provides access to you, it collects all that information and validate. Sometimes Microsoft doesn't provide you access immediately to the Azure. If you found that there is some kind of an malpractice which is happening based on their security measures, so someone from Microsoft will call us saying that, hey, have you created an account in Azure, and for what purpose you create an account? They try to basically get the information, and based on the inputs we provide, they activate our account. Otherwise, the account will be in a suspended mode. So first and foremost step, what we need to do is we need to create an Azure account. So it is an identification of basically within our this thing. So it looks like this now. So on Azure, we don't need to set up an individual account for individual region. If you have one account in Azure, we are eligible to use the resources across any regions. Especially there are certain data centers where we are not allowed, like in US government, China government, some restricted government data centers are being built by Microsoft. We are not allowed to do that. But in many data centers, we can use it. But some data centers have some restrictions. But however, as if I have one Azure account created, as in logically, I can create resources in any particular data centers or consume the services of any data center. Now, we use a terminology called as an Azure subscriptions. Azure subscriptions. So Azure subscription is a logical container within the Azure account. Within the Azure account is a billing boundary. It is a resource boundary. So what does that mean by it? Now we have a development environment, a testing environment, production environment. I'm just taking a simple example. So I have a development environment, I have a testing environment, I have a production environment. Now I really want to know the cost of the development environment, and I want to isolate the resources, all the resources which are being created from the production environment. And I really want to know the cost of the testing resources, and I really want to know the cost of the production, and I want to have an independent bill invoices, generated independent invoices, then access control. It basically allows us to delegate permissions at a subscription level, delegate permissions at the subscription level. So now what we can have it now, we can have a separate subscription for development, and which generates a separate invoice for development. We can have a separate subscription for testing, and we can create all the resources, and we can provide permissions only to the set of people for testing environment. And we can have a production and subscription, and all the resources belong to the production can be kept under that subscription. And we can have a separate billing, and we can provide access only to the specific people for production. Now, so by having a subscription, I'm able to segregate my cost and able to know the cost of the each things. Second, I can delegate permissions. Again, I delegate permissions, and I can restrict the communication between the resources. So in order to consume the services of Azure, an account should have at least one subscription active, one active subscription. One active subscription. It means Azure account should have at least one active subscription. So by default, when we create an Azure account, the Azure will create a free subscription, which is worth of some 12,000 rupees and valid for 1 month. So we can basically play around with the resources, and post to that, we need to buy the subscriptions in order to create the resources. create the resource. It means that we need to have at least one active subscription in place in order to consume the services of Azure. So within the Azure account, these are my subscriptions, like a multiple subscriptions which can be created. So I'll take two subscriptions. Let me take one more. For the sake of better, we'll take only two here. Now this I'm calling it as a subscription, which I'm calling it as a development. This I'm calling it as a subscription as a production. So these are now. The subscription can consume the resources from any regions. There is no restriction that this subscription can use only the resources from South India. This restrictions can only use from Central India, nothing like that. Now the second place where we would need subscriptions. Now I have business in India, I have business in UK, I have business in US. Now the applications which are being used by US will be paid by the US, and the resources which are being consumed by the UK will be paid by the UK organization, and the resources which are being consumed by the India will be paid by the India, and that resources should reside on India. Now there is a different set of requirement from a business. It is not only the cost and permissions. Now you look at this business requirement called as taxation. Now all the resources which are consumed by India should be charged, billed to the India organization. India will pay as per to the India organization will pay as per to the Indian government in taxations. In that kind of situations also, we can have a separate subscriptions like an India subscription, UK subscription, and US subscription, and the invoices can be generated in respect to their taxation and can be submitted to the customer, and their respective organizations can pay accordingly. In that kind of situations also, you can have multiple subscriptions which can be created. As I said, there is no restriction in terms of consumption of resources in any specific regions. So if I have one subscription, I can consume the resources in any geographical regions. Either it could be South India or Central India or a UK East or a UK West, or like in whatever called as a Singapore East or West, something like that. So there's no restriction. We just need an active subscription where the resources are part of it. Now, we use the terminology called as a resource group. Azure resource group. Now, Azure resource group is a logical container within the subscription. Now, the resource group cannot exist without a subscription. It is a part of the subscription or within the subscription. It's basically resource is collection of resources, a collection of a similar resources. I would say a logical grouping of resources, grouping of similar resources. What does that mean by it? Now, within the production environment, there are so many applications. So I have a web applications, I have database servers, I have an data warehouse servers, I have an security firewalls, I have some different kind of basically now. I want to logically separate them, saying that, hey, these are the set of resources which belongs to data warehouse. These are the set of resources which belongs to the web applications. These are the set of resources which belongs to the database. These are the set of resources which belongs to that. Now, Azure is going to logically map them to the resource group. Later point of time, we can move the resources from one resource group to another group, one subscription to another subscription at a later point of time. But a resource can be part of only one subscription and one resource group. A resource cannot be part of multiple subscriptions and multiple resource groups. Now, within the subscription, we can create called as resource groups where the resources are going to be created, logically mapped to the resource group under the subscription. So now, under the subscription, we have called as resource groups. Resource groups. So we can have n number of resource groups. So I'm calling it as a resource group called as web applications. Web called as web. A resource group called as a database. Databases. A resource group called as VS apps. Similarly, in a production, we can have a different set of resource groups. I'm saying called as SAP servers. I'm calling it databases. I'm getting called as front-end resources. Now, the resource group is a subset of subscription. It is not outside of the subscription. It is within the subscription. It's within the subscription. So when we create a resource, the resource will actually sit in any one of the regions. And logically, the resource is sitting in basically South India. And part of a resource group called as a database. And this resource group is part of a subscription called as a development. And this subscription is part of an account called as some, I would say called as an acute learn as a tenant, or I would say called as an account. Now, a VM as a resource is created on a South India region and belongs to a resource group. Now, all the resources which belongs to the VM will be created under this resource group. And this resource group belongs to a subscription called as a development, and basically called as a tenant called as an account called as an acute learn. Now, a resource group doesn't have any restrictions. It can consist of resources from any geographical regions. Any geographical regions. So I can create virtual machines across the regions. Across the regions. So one resource group can have multiple resources created, which can be logically grouped. So in order to create any resource, there should be at least one resource group should exist in order to create resources. In order to create resources. So, what is our first step? The first step is we need to create an Azure account. Azure account. So once we have an Azure account, then we need to have an active subscription to a subscription, or I would say called as a buy a subscription. Third step, create a resource group. Now, during the creation of the resource itself, we can create a resource group, but however, create a resource group, design the resource group structure. So before you start creating the resources in Azure, you can design it. Okay, hey, I'm going to have these kind of resources. Okay, so I'm going to have a resource group for web applications. I'm going to have a separate resource group for databases. I'm going to have a separate resource group for Visual Studio apps. I'm going to have like and link these things under this subscription. Now, when I'm doing the creation of a resource, I choose this particular resource group. I choose this particular resource group. That's how it should be. Okay, that's where we see called as resources, resource groups. Now, resource is basically a VM. Resource is a VM. A resource can be a container. A resource can be an app service. A resource can be a network adapter. A resource can be a disk. A resource can be a SQL database. Anything which we create in Azure, we call it as a resource. You call it as a resource. So every time we create a manage a resource in Azure, we use these two terminologies. One more is a region. So which always choose which region, which subscription, which resource group. So whenever we create any kind of a resource in Azure, we need to choose region, in which region you are going to create a resource, and which subscription, and which resource group. These three are compulsory, mandatory to provide input during the creation of the resource. Based on the region, you might get certain services availability, certain services may not be availability. That you need to decide it. So that's the what we call as in subscriptions resources and subscriptions resource groups. Now, when we create a subscription, so Microsoft will ask us what kind of support you want for a subscription. So Microsoft has an various supports, Azure support plans. So we see called as a basic plan, a developer plan, a standard plan, professional direct. So as a basic, included for Azure customers, by default, it is included in the subscription cost. Included for all Azure customers. They provide like building support, 24 resource, including the learning portal and these things. But third-party software support, technical support are not available in the basic. Now we have a developer's plan, support plan. Now, if you buy a developer support plan, now it is going to cost $29 per month, trial and non-trial production environment. And like an additionally, we get like a health status and notifications, Azure advisories and other things. Now, when you go to the purchase standard, which is costing USD 100 per month, production workload environments, not very mission critical, but web applications. Now you get a lot of support from Microsoft. Minimal business impact severity within 8 hours they'll attend. Moderate business impact within the 4 hours they will attend. Critical business impact within 1 hour they basically support. And architecture support, general guidance will be available. Like support APIs, operational support, training are not available as part of the standard support. Now we're going to go to the professional direct. Is the highest level of support plan available from Microsoft, which costs $1,000 per month. And for this can be used for business critical applications. You have some kind of a business critical applications running, a mission critical applications running, and you needed Microsoft support, then you can go for it. They have a very good support. We see called as a 1 hour support of basically business hours. And within 2 hours and within 1 hour of basically, if in case of severity, they will attend the call within the 1 hour of time. They will basically try it. And they provide you a lot of other benefits when we go with basically called as a professional, a direct, and Microsoft will try to assign one technical person to us as an account manager or an architect or some solution architect who can help us on this particular things, you can do that. So before you start creating resources, anything, you also decide which support plan is required for you. And the design you are basically called as this number of subscriptions which are required. And within the subscriptions, how many number of resource groups are required, and which particular geographical location we are going to create. Okay. So that's the Azure architectural components. So the Azure regions and availability zones are part of infrastructure. Account is the one, which is an identification in the Azure. And subscriptions, we can have multiple subscriptions under the Azure account. And subscription is basically billing boundary, access boundary, and resource boundary. Resource group is a logical container within the subscription. So we can have group the list and a set of resources under resource group. Then we have resources which are created basically like a virtual business container, and various support plans are available. You can choose which plan you want to have from Microsoft support. Okay. Right. In the next session, we'll try to understand how do we create an Azure account and how to interact with the Azure portal and navigate through the subscriptions, resource groups, and everything.